thanks to Dr. Van Horn for her coordination of this and just all of the things that she's done to keep these topics in front of you in the district there. We're going to spend today talking about, in a very brief way, the topic of person-centered practices and how they intersect with what we call person-centered cultural humility, which may be a little bit different than the kind of cultural training you have experienced. Most of us in our field, most of us who've been around for a while have received some kind of training about culture, and we've incorporated some of those concepts because they are wonderful things to keep in mind. But we do think that it has evolved somewhat, particularly as we think about person-centered practices and what's expected of us in the home and community-based services final rule. My name is Tanya Richmond. I am with Support Development Associates, which is a small consulting firm that is headquartered in Annapolis, Maryland. I live in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is sunny and gorgeous today, absolutely beautiful. And it's getting to be spring, so I may demonstrate for you my mating call, which is the sneeze. I'll be doing that a lot probably. The allergy pills just don't touch that. We are an organization that's really focused on person-centered practices and training and organizational development with a person-centered approach. And a lot of our work brings us into contact with state systems and departments who work with people who use services and supports, which is how we came to be with you today. I'm a clinical social worker by training, so I tell stories out of my own practice. I also do private practice as a social worker, doing traditional clinical social work online. And I am most recently, in the last couple of years, certified as both a death doula and most recently last week as an arts therapist or an art therapy practitioner. So I use person-centered practices in all those aspects, and I hope that that's how you will take away the information today, just thinking about how it applies with what you do on a daily basis and how it kind of overlaps or intersects with culture in our work and on a daily basis in our communities and in our families and homes. So I'm curious to know who you work with, and I'm thinking about kind of in broad sweeps, if you would use chat to answer this question. And to find the chat, if you will hover towards the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen, it's different for different folks, you will see a little chat bubble where you can type who you work with. So if you will, think about that for a moment. Let us know who's here. That may help me customize or tailor stories just a little bit, or examples as we spend time together. So I'm thinking about things like I work with older adults who have dementia, might be a way you describe that. But however you can get yourself described in that chat, that would be great for today. And we're going to use the chat a lot as we spend time together today. We're also going to do something very daring and put this number of people in breakout rooms, which we don't typically do with big groups, but we think that you are smarter than the average group that we work with and that you will figure this out with us together. I see folks who are working in quality assurance, people who are coordinating IDS. I won't get to all of you, I'm sure, but it'll be helpful to kind of see this. I see community services. I see someone who's with the National Children's Center, QIDP, and I may not know all of your acronyms, so I'll do my best if I can sort that out. I see a number of people who are professionals who are in the psychology field. I see, let's see what else. I feel like was it Mr. Rogers with his spyglass? I see some community agencies in terms of kind of more medically facing types of services. I see social facing types of services. Let's see, behavior support. I see nurses. We have everybody. We have a dentist. Let's see, government supported employee contracts, disability office of rights. So we have advocates here. That is wonderful. Please keep adding that to the chat, if you will. I won't linger too long just to keep us on track, but I see someone who's the sibling of a 72-year-old sister with developmental disabilities and encounters other in this population in my church and my community. And the great thing about this, because you all come from such a broad array of backgrounds, I mean, pretty much everything from birth to end of life is covered in the list that I see here. Person-centered practices just work with human beings. So luckily, if people have a pulse, these work. And we're going to talk a little bit about that together. This is the only training that I ever do where we don't do a deep dive into a person-centered skill, where we actually practice it. This is really thinking about it kind of in a broader perspective with how it overlaps or overlays with culture. And I'll give you a few more tips about that soon. I also think it's helpful, although, and you all may have some ideas as well about what would be helpful to you. I think it's helpful, particularly with a group our size, to have a few agreements about how we spend our time together. And to that end, it's helpful to be present as much as you possibly can be. I get it. We are pulled in a bunch of different directions. There is all kinds of stuff going on around you, and people rely on you for a million things. And so as best you can in the little bit of time that we have together today, please try to limit your multitasking. And that would include things like checking emails and taking phone calls and all the stuff that's being asked of you. I realize that you won't be able to shut it down 100%. So I'll ask you to please just do your best to be present, because we're going to ask you to participate in things like breakout rooms today, where you go in with 5 to 8 people and talk with one another about your experiences. And I do think that is where the most beautiful learning happens. So as best you can, just listen for those instructions, be as present with one another and with me as you possibly can be. And also only share what you're comfortable sharing. Because we're talking about culture and we're talking about our own experiences, I think sometimes that can feel a little bit sensitive. Maybe not all of our experiences have been good ones. Maybe we've been overwhelmed by something that we've experienced. So please do take care of yourself. And if there are things that pop up, and what happens with good conversations is things do pop up, right? We're having a great conversation, something else comes up, and it reminds us that we want to talk about this, but it may not be what we're talking about at the moment. So put that in a parking lot, if you will, hold each other accountable. I'll try to hold you accountable. I am chief among us of people who will wander off in a conversation and include other stuff. So I'll try to behave myself as well. And then finally, just be patient with one another. I always think that's a nice reminder to us, because even though we seem to be getting back in the swing of things and past the pandemic, though it's still going on, it's still new to engage this way, where we're kind of isolated from one another, particularly when we're talking about culture and our experiences. I know I would prefer, and you probably are like me in this, many of you are like me in this, that you'd like to be at a table with one another, just having a conversation. But this is what we have available to us, and we're going to make the best of it. If there's anything else that you need that I did not cover here, would be helpful for you in making this a good session, please do let us know by putting that in chat. I'll ask Debbie to keep an eye out for that. I didn't introduce Debbie Paul. She's with our office at Support Development Associates, and she is going to be assisting me by watching the chat, making sure you all are okay. And she also helped you probably register for this training as well. So thank you, Debbie, for that. But Debbie will alert me if there's anything there. Same with questions. That's a great place to put your questions. If something comes up and you just don't want to interrupt at that moment, you absolutely are free to put it in the chat, and Debbie will alert me if it's something that the whole group needs to be aware of. All right, I think that's it for kind of setting some ground rules or meeting agreements, and we can move on to talk about what we're going to talk about, which is culture, and particularly the expectation that we will be culturally sensitive in the home and community-based services expectations when we're planning with people. So I think none of us disagree that that's a good idea. We say, yes, it should be culturally sensitive. But what does that mean? Practically, what do we do about that? I'm going to touch back to concepts that I would guarantee are familiar with most of you. Cultural competency, cultural proficiency. I think we do get a lot of training on that in our field. And it's around us all the time. But I also want to take that a little bit further and talk about it from a person-centered perspective, talking about cultural humility, person-centered cultural humility. We also are going to talk a little bit about bias and implicit bias, how our values got developed, what happens with our values over the course of our life. And then we're going to give you a couple of opportunities to engage in some action learning so that you can have conversations with one another. All of that is really to help us understand how cultural humility applies to the home and community-based services and supports, and some of those key aspects of person-centered cultural humility that are anticipated that you will include in planning with people. And we also want you to be able to kind of describe how it is different than our traditional concepts of cultural competency and cultural proficiency. So how is person-centered cultural humility and evolution of that? All of that so that you can expand your knowledge. And at the end of this training, we will also give you some resources. If you have further questions, if you're curious about some of the resources we used, we've linked them for you at the end of the training. And I know that you all will have, if you do not have now, access to the slides. I think those will be distributed to you in some fashion. All right, so culture, great big topic. And for our purposes today, I'm going to keep myself focused on things like language, religion, race, food, social habits, music, art, many more things that might show up in this conversation today. But culture is much broader than that. And because it's a big world, culture is a gigantic topic, and it's especially a big topic to cover in just a few hours. So within the time frame that we have, we're not going to discuss all the things I just listed to you, but we're more going to focus on how cultural humility is a good starting point for all of us in working with people from a person-centered perspective, because it needs to be present when we address looking at culture, particularly when we are planning with people. When we're learning about individual people and how they see themselves in their cultural circumstances, in their developmental phase, in the place where they are in the world. Person-centered skills, the same skills that you use in all of your person-centered conversations, in all of your work, are really helpful in exploring culture. Because when people are receiving services and supports, that is an expectation that we will think about how culture impacts their decision making. How does it impact the services and supports that they want to receive or should receive? And we also have the role really of helping people describe cultural connections and what they mean to the person. So how it gives them purpose and meaning. I might even call that their worldview. So it's a lot to think about. And the good news is you don't have to learn special person-centered skills for this. These are the same person-centered skills you use in every other bit of your work, in every other bit of your community. It is really about learning to use those with a cultural lens applied. So when we think about culture, and particularly for our conversation today, we're going to talk about it as an agreed upon way of doing things that's recognized by a group of people. So it could be a social group, it could be a nation, a family, it could be your work team. But usually what we're referring to is a group of people. However, we are going to also touch on how it can be a single person and call that a culture of one, a person-centered concept that I'd like to add to just your thinking and the way you practice. In addition to assisting culturally diverse populations in the work that we do, we may also find ourselves assisting people and addressing issues that might involve things like child welfare or mental health. I mean, you all came from a variety of backgrounds: human rights, fair housing, substance use. I saw everything there. And the understanding and the acceptance that all people, thinking about that, and like all people results from practicing cultural competence in and cultural humility in our work. It's vital to serving communities equitably and compassionately. And that's why it is such an important focus of the home and community-based services rule. So let's talk a little bit about what's expected of you as a result of that. If you remember, and not everybody is deeply steeped in the legislation, so I'm going to give you just a very tiny overview of this. But the home and community-based services rule is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services overarching kind of federal or national guidance And pretty much in every training that you would have come to with me, if it's person-centered in nature, we talk about that because there's a great push in our nation right now to get our services and supports in alignment with what's expected of us in the home and community-based services final rule. And at the end of the training, I've actually provided a website for you. If you have questions, you don't understand how it intersects for you, maybe you haven't dug that deeply into it, you can go there for additional information. I also think it's important because there's a lot of myth out there about what the rule is and what's going to happen with it. So I just think getting it straight from the source is the best thing you can possibly do. But the expectation is that our plans, person-centered plans for people who use supports and services under these funding streams, have the information in them that's needed to support people to participate in the planning process as much as they can. Or in our person-centered lingo, we say drive the planning process. So we really want to make sure people are in the center of all the decisions about their life as much as they possibly can be. They also need to include people who are chosen by the person. So some of you might be having a little notion right now, like, well, I work with people who can't tell me. They maybe don't use words, or they communicate in ways that are somewhat atypical, and they can't tell me who should be a part of their plan. So we would use our person-centered skills, just like we do in all of the work we do, to understand what's important to the person just by observing and really thinking about who is close to that person by what we pick up from the people who are around them, and inviting people into that conversation based on strength of relationship. There's also an expectation that those plans happen at times and locations that are convenient to the person, and that they help people achieve person-centered outcomes, so outcomes that they define for themselves. And my shortcut for that is it's really about understanding from the person's perspective what represents balance between what's important to them and what's important for them. How do we describe that in such a way that it guides a plan? And that way, the people who pick up the plan know what they're supposed to do, what's their role in serving or supporting that person. In addition to that, it reflects the person's preferences and choices, their personal preferences and choices, and takes into consideration the culture of the person that we're serving. And that's where we're focusing really all of our time today talking is about culture. There's also an expectation that it uses plain language. And if we're doing all of these things, it makes the plan accessible. So we often in the past, as we've taught people to plan, and I've certainly said this, I taught at UNC Chapel Hill for years as a social worker. We taught people to plan, and we said, make sure that it's in the person's voice. And that gets interpreted in all kinds of ways, even in the grammar of plans. But truly what this means when we say using plain language and making sure that it reflects the person's voice is you should be able to hear the person in the plan. So as you pick that up, you would say, oh yeah, that would absolutely make sense for this person. This absolutely would be how this person would want to live their life if you knew them well. But it also has to be written in such a way that the people who are using the plan know what to do with it. So it has to be useful to the users of the plan. So let's shift a little bit and talk about the concepts for which we are here to talk about today, which are culture. And to give you a definition of cultural competence, and as I said, this is probably where you've done some training or some learning in your own career. But thinking about cultural competence, it might include things like what a person wears. Maybe they wear a particular piece of clothing that appears to be from their culture. I often train this training with a person of color, and her husband is from a country in Africa. So he wears African garb often when we do this training together. So he often will kind of like hold up his shirt and say, you know, this is a piece of clothing for my culture. His wife often wears a piece of jewelry that was gifted to her from Africa as well, but she's actually from the Bronx. And so she talks about Bronx culture. So thinking about that and being respectful when we're talking to people, if we notice something like that, might be one just example of cultural competence. We notice, we bring it out. We comment on it, but we do it in such a way that's welcoming and warm. Or being more aware of our own culture and our own worldviews. So we often think about the differences between us and other people, but do we often think about our own worldviews and how those came into play? And or how those come into play in our work. And that's where we'll spend a little time thinking today. Because to do that, we have to be willing to learn more about the person and what their culture means to them. And if you remember from our person-centered trainings, we talk a lot about what's important to people or the stuff that sits on their heart. Very often, culture sits on the person's heart. It sits at the core of the person. So cultural competence is really about understanding who you are and who others are, and continuing to learn and reflect on our own practices and our beliefs. So if you look kind of at the slide here, if you can see it, if not, I'll just kind of walk through it. But the ability to understand and communicate effectively and interact with others across cultures comes into play when we think about cultural competence. And really, that's about being open-minded, being kind of a blank slate as we approach people, and respectful of cultural differences in people that we meet. We also have to understand first our own worldview. And so today, when we talk about in our breakout rooms, one of those is really thinking about where our worldviews came from. That can help us understand our cultural beliefs and how they got developed. And really, those beliefs cause us to have a set of behavior patterns, thoughts, mannerisms, actions. And if you think about it, when we think about cultural beliefs, usually that gets passed down to us through generations. So that is something that comes down to us in our learning as we grow up and wherever we're living. And that could positively impact us. It could also negatively influence communications and relationships with the people that we are serving and supporting. So knowing ourselves first is really key to being culturally proficient or competent and skilled in honoring other cultures. We also challenge ourselves to develop positive attitudes. And if we continue to do that, if we continue to learn about cultural practices of the people we support, both the similarities and the differences between people from all cultural groups, it really gives us the best frame of mind for being able to be culturally humble as we interact with people. And the final point here is really about gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, understanding that often what we experience as we are trying to serve or support, or we are trying to access services or supports ourselves, there are cultural barriers that come into play. So it might be things like stigma, and stigma is a set of negative or often unfair beliefs that people have about something. Typically about groups. So for example, a very common stigma that we hear about in our world all the time is the stigma of having a mental illness or seeking treatment for mental illness. But there are lots of cultural barriers that are things like literacy or just limited language abilities, unfamiliar with the service system, not knowing that there are things out there that may assist. Experiences of racism, oppression, discrimination, more overt things that happen to people, trauma, just to name a few things that might be cultural barriers. And we also have to make a personal and professional commitment to learn about people from cultural groups that are different from our own, but turn that into knowledge that and skills that are really required to help us do our work better. So how we talk and respond to others can grow out of this cultural competency that we're developing. But cultural, to provide good support and help people work towards a meaningful life as they define it for themselves. So a life in balance between what is important to them and what's important for them, it's really necessary for us to become first more culturally competent. And that takes time, it takes practice, and it takes a willingness to learn. So it's a journey, we often say. It's not a destination. Cultural competence almost implies that we have kind of arrived somewhere. So we feel like it's got a few limitations, and I'll share that with you in just a few moments. But cultural humility is a disposition, and it's really about trusting and learning from people from different cultures and backgrounds. And it entails us seeking knowledge about other cultures and respecting cultural backgrounds of others. So it requires us, if we're working with people, to recognize what we don't know. It's often hard to know what we don't know, isn't it? And in practice, we find ourselves having to show cultural humility by identifying where we have implicit biases, and we will work around biases here in just a few minutes, and seeking to understand our own cultural context and the context of the people that we work with. And cultural humility typically has about 3 key tenets. The first one is about reflecting for yourself, so self-reflection and lifelong learning. A recognition that there are power imbalances that are inherent in our system, and particularly in that provider client dynamic, and a desire to make that difference, so to overcome those, and to work to develop effective partnerships between culturally diverse individuals and the institutions and the communities that they rely on. So all of that is probably stuff that is somewhat familiar to you, because you have probably studied cultural competence from, given the work that you do and where you are in the world. But in the late 1990s, there were 2 doctors who thought a lot about the limits of the use of cultural competence. And they were really interested in thinking about how it was impacting poor people, or people who were in communities that were underserved. And they saw a need to be more culturally sensitive, which included understanding how there are power imbalances that are built into our systems, or differences in power, and that can really, in their research, it was really about the doctor-patient relationship. But there are a lot of different power imbalances that we'll talk about in just a moment. And what they realized, that over time, that if they were regularly mindful and they were actively checking in with themselves when they talked with the people that they saw as patients, that they were using cultural humility. And this is different from being culturally competent. Culturally competent is about what we seek to know and what we learn. And really, cultural humility is almost more about what we don't know. As we said, cultural competence is really a journey that doesn't end. But the word competence might make someone think that you can become culturally competent through one learning experience, like taking a training. That would be like me saying I can become a very healthy person by eating 1 stick of broccoli. And I think most of us would sign up for that, right? If we could get away with 1 stick of broccoli and then you're done, you're healthy forever. But cultural competence does have some limitations, and that's what these doctors kind of pointed out. It's more focused on learning new knowledge. So getting good at speaking and communicating with those who are different from us. So basically checking a box that we've learned about cultural competence. And that includes learning about the other person's culture, usually without having really to think about our own culture or our own background. In a lot of ways, that cultural competency has been tested. Being white or Caucasian was really understood to be the standard. So that was what was normal, and as compared to others who are different from the standard. And that causes a problem, right? It causes a power imbalance just in the way that the structure of that notion is set up. So we're going to cover more about that later when we talk about biases. Because we all have them and we need to be aware of them when we are supporting people. In addition to that, cultural competency does not include the presence of social justice issues. And many of us have been involved in social justice work. In the last few years in particular, that's become much more prevalent. And it can impact the power differences or the imbalances that exist, such as provider and client relationships. And I know many of you are familiar with this as well. And a limited understanding of culture as race, ethnicity, minority group, et cetera, is one of the other aspects of culture, as we defined a little bit earlier in this presentation. So that's a limitation, that cultural competency, there's a potential to really stereotype groups, groups that are made up of people who are naturally different from each other in important ways. So when we think about it, the evolution is really cultural humility. And it fits nicely with, and it can be considered to be a key aspect of being more person-centered in our approach to culture. And in fact, that's why we call this training person-centered cultural humility, because it's a lifelong process. It's focusing on learning about ourselves and the people that we work with and challenging our own beliefs. So it includes things like self-reflection, reflection, and personal critique of how we behave and what we say. And it also addresses those things like the power imbalances that are built into those relationships, like doctor-patient or provider-client, or person who's receiving services, person who's providing services. So it turns the expert into a learner and the person being served and supported into an expert in themselves. And I really like that approach, because that is in perfect alignment with what we do when we learn about what's important to people in person-centered practices. So every time we talk with someone, we get an opportunity to have an experience that's fresh, it's new, and it requires an attitude of openness and egolessness, and it involves a supportive interaction. So we should be focused in those conversations on learning about the other person and learning from our differences. So there's a fair amount of interpersonal skills that are at work here, and the understanding that our differences have something to teach us about ourselves as well. So I don't want to throw out cultural competency altogether. However, I think both can be useful. There are a lot of benefits to using cultural humility within a person-centered approach, but cultural competence can and still should be used to help you with the lifelong practice of using cultural humility. You're always going to be seeking new information, learning what you don't know. And especially as we described it in the person-centered lens, we can't toss out cultural competence altogether, but we need to recognize that it does have some limitations, and it can still be useful to us. So a handy way to remember how to have conversations from a person-centered standpoint that actually include cultural concepts or include cultural humility is to ask questions in a way that are humble and safe. So if we're, for example, just the one I gave you about talking about a garment that someone's wearing, you might ask about the name of the garment, or are the colors significant, those kinds of things. And that would be an easy kind of warm introduction to having a conversation with someone that includes a cultural piece. It acknowledges that you see that, but you also have curiosity about what you're seeing. We have to seek self-awareness, suspend judgment, and for human beings, I think that can be mighty difficult. I think we enjoy judging a lot. I have to work on this one a lot myself. Expressing compassion and kindness, so creating that space with others that is safe and welcoming, and really starting where the person is. So I think about this when we talked about on the previous slide with cultural competency, having that blank slate or that egoless about us. Practically what that means is we have to do something in the way we talk with people, and this mnemonic may help us kind of remember how to structure those conversations. If we're going to be culturally humble, we have to work into our conversations ways to make the other person comfortable as we bring a cultural lens to our person-centered conversation. We also have probably learned, you probably have learned about cultural proficiency. And to provide person-centered support, you could start by becoming more aware and having the right attitude. Some of the things I already talked with you about, learning about your own culture, thinking about your assumptions, not assuming you understand someone else based on how they look. Always trying to learn more about the other as an individual person, being open to learning, doing your research, all of those things. But when we talk about proficiency, there's a little bit of a different twist here. So when I say the word proficiency, if you would use chat to answer this for me, what does it mean to be proficient at something? What does it mean to be proficient at something? Would you respond in chat for me, please? It mean to be proficient at something? Competent and qualified, I see. Knowledgeable, 100% understanding, capable to know what you're doing, not a novice anymore. Yeah. Good. So we have some agreement from those of us who responded that there's a level of skill there, advanced skill, effective, very knowledgeable, those kinds of things. So usually it's something we're good enough at to be able to teach. And if you think about the steps it took to become proficient at something, maybe you are, some of you train a specific model of something, or some of you, are actually really proficient bakers. I'm a terrible baker. I'm a great cook, but I'm a terrible baker. Maybe some of you can fix cars, or there's a sport that you're really good at. So when you think about what it took to become proficient at that, it took time, first of all. It also took a lot of practice, and it took a willingness to learn. So if you are a proficient baker, the very first thing you baked might have turned out okay. It also may have needed tweaking. And that's what we do with our recipes, right? We try things different. We add a little bit more moisture. We take away this ingredient. We add a different ingredient. And we learn every time we approach something from a different perspective. So proficiency doesn't necessarily mean you're an expert, but it means you're good at it. And it means that you're willing to put that knowledge and skill into action every time you respond to a novel situation. So when we think about that, cultural competency is everything that we spoke of on those previous slides, but cultural proficiency builds out of that. And it's a bit about realizing that culture influences our thinking, our feelings, our assumptions, our ideas about who we are and how we interact. And from that learning, how we choose to act and respond, particularly in this case with culture in mind. So if you'll watch for the bullets on the slide here, I'm going to round those out with a little bit more of a description for you. On the first one about understanding what culture is and how important it is in people's lives, we might find ourselves in a person-centered conversation listening for cultural values and the way that this person is an individual in the context of that greater culture. Understanding and honoring differences within and between cultures. Sometimes we have I would say I'm saying me, I'm a victim and perpetrator of everything I tell you in training. Sometimes we have a notion that what we've done with someone of a particular culture might actually work with someone of the same culture, but it's a different person altogether. So understanding that the same thing we've done with one person or family may not be the same thing that we will do with others, and being open to and to learning about and understanding something new. So being able to respect and be open to learning from that individual person, and being flexible in our approach to meet the needs of that person individually. We also have, I think, a responsibility when we are being culturally proficient in our work to view diversity as a benefit, because diversity is a gift in that we learn from one another, and it really gives us an opportunity for connection that no other concept really does. We might celebrate through the things that make us similar, or even through the things that make us different. And we can empower one another's gifts and talents as we think about the struggles and the adversity that different groups have experienced in the lives that they're living. But we can also build and nurture stronger communities if we're paying attention to that. So if we make assumptions of who people are based on their identity, we miss opportunities to actually connect with them. So that's one of the great benefits of being more culturally humble in our practice, is it helps us create connection and build trust. Interacting knowledgeably and respectfully among and across cultural groups. And that can be a challenge if we don't know anything about those cultural groups. It takes time to ask questions, to listen and exercise. It also means that we have to be non-judgmental. It's being honest about what we know and what we don't know, and really being willing to learn. So please take into account that even though we all might live in you all live in the same city or somewhere near one another, right? But you all experience the world very differently. You live in different groups, you work in different work cultures. And being culturally proficient really reminds us to be mindful of our own experience and ask others how they experience the world around them, and really being truly willing to hear from them what we need to understand to work well within that community, or successfully with people from a variety of different cultures. building an appreciation of cultures into the work of our organization. And if you think about your organization's culture, do you honor the different cultures that are represented in your staff and the people that you support? Or if you don't work for an agency, because I realize that some of you are here participating in this who are not professionals working in this field, think about the culture of your family. And we have to think about our assumptions, and that, you know, a person who speaks Spanish may have similar customs and beliefs to others who speak Spanish, and they may also have very different beliefs than others who speak Spanish, because there are many, many cultures or countries represented under that umbrella. And we also have to think about how can we adapt the work that we do, our organizations and our systems, to people instead of asking them to adapt to us. I'm just checking chat because I saw a few things coming through. Want to make sure we have not missed anything, and it looks like folks are still answering. Thank you so much for participating in chat. I think it makes it a much richer conversation. We also need to think about cultural groups, and with group culture is important, and it can really inform us about who a person is through their association in a particular group and how they show up in the world and how they see the world, while also balancing the importance of getting to know the person on an individual level. So cultural groups are an important part of our identity and our experiences, because we don't just belong to ourselves as people, we belong to cultural groups, and that further defines who we are as individuals. And if we spend our time in person-centered conversations really understanding the groups that people belong to and how they identify in the context of that larger group, it's a better opportunity for us to understand the core of the person. But knowing a person's cultural or group membership can tell us what might be important to the person. And through those relationships and connections, we may be able to better support someone to work towards a meaningful life as they see it. This comes into play as we think about how we match people to services and supports, or how people are matched to people who are providing services and supports for them, and how we help people have a life where they feel valued, so that they are seen as bringing value to their community, which creates a life of inclusion. It creates belonging. And we spend a lot of time in our field thinking about how can we do this for every person we work with. But people's beliefs and values may be very strong, even in cultural groups, but it's important to recognize that people think and act differently from those groups as well at times. And that's why person-centered practices challenges us not to just look at the cultural group on the larger level in a very generic sense, but to think about how that is only really scratching the surface of understanding someone's culture. Even though the term culture is often used when we're describing things about races or ethnicity or religions, most people experience and participate in different cultural groups just by walking through their day. So you probably have already participated in the culture of your family this morning. You may have come into a work environment where you have a different work culture. You may have been somewhere in the city or in a town where you've experienced the culture of another group. So our daily lives give us the opportunity to shift from culture to culture to culture. And we are able to generally adapt or change throughout the day our behavior, typically unconsciously, but sometimes consciously, as we move between these groups. And when we think about our own lives, we may be able to see how different our work cultures are from our social group cultures, right? So these are all things that we experience all day long, every day. And it impacts how we behave. It impacts how we make decisions. So I want you to think about groups that you belong to, and I'm going to ask you just to respond in chat. So groups that might be based around maybe your hobbies or your interests. Some of you may be in Facebook groups, sports groups, faith groups, all kinds of things. So what kinds of groups do you belong to? What kind of groups do you belong to? Would you put that in chat for me? I see an alumni group, democratic organizations, and hyper local government elected official, sorority, church community, sports. There's a running group, a faith group. I won't get all these because I have a hard time scrolling and talking and running the slides all at once. It's kind of wacky over here. President of Family Reunion. Oh, that sounds like a job. Faith and alumni group, church group, a lot of church community, nurse association, psychiatric nurse association, Maryland Nurse Association, social group, a walking group, a choir. All right, a lot of alumni groups, a lot of faith groups, fraternities and sororities. I see church, lots of different groups that we belong to. And if you think about it, oh, condo board, a fitness group. So yeah, lots of us. I belong to a group of yoga practitioners. I belong to a group of artists. So lots of things going on there. Now, I want you to think about if we took the time to have a conversation about all the different groups that we see there, we would learn something about each of you individually that speaks to your culture. And it may be a part of your own identity or how you see the world or how you show up in the world. But we may also find that we have things in common and some opportunities for connections. So I want you to hold on to that notion because a little bit later, we're going to come back to this idea of groups and how they either define us or don't. All right, now I got to figure out how to make this slide move after I've started looking at chat. There we go. So we can also think about getting to know people as whole people and not making assumptions or assigning labels based on their culture, race, ethnicity, or identity as a person-centered concept. And we would call that a culture of one. In person-centered approaches, you know that we pay attention to the person at the individual level, where we discover what the person values most. So what their core beliefs are, I always say what sits on their heart, what really is at the core of that person. But this also may be a way for us to understand what they believe, what they value, what their preferences are. And in our person-centered practices, we avoid using labels for people. So we don't put people in certain categories as often as we can. We really try to help people shed their label. And we recognize also that when we put a cultural label on someone, we may neglect to look at that person individually. So I'm a Cajun woman. If you just put the label Cajun on me, you probably all have a notion, if you've heard of Cajuns, what that means. Like, what does it mean to be a Cajun person? But I've been outside of the state of Louisiana for more years than I lived in the state of Louisiana. So there's a lot of things that I do differently and believe differently than the typical, as I would say, stereotypical Cajun person might. So a person-centered approach considered everyone as having their own culture or a culture of one, and everyone has their own history and beliefs and values, their experiences, their preferences within the cultural groups that they belong to, and knowing those individual differences is really essential in helping us determine how to best support a person. And while we acknowledge that it's really important to get to know the person for who they are as an individual, it's also really important to understand that person in the context of the groups that they belong to, or they feel they belong to. So this came into play for me back in December. My sister received a diagnosis of cancer, and I went to Texas to care for her. She got the diagnosis on December 12th, and she died on January 11th. So a very short amount of time. And there's a notion there in the South, and I'm from the South, that we take care of our own. So family takes care of family. And you probably have seen this in supporting people yourselves. There are cultural notions that kind of come into play that impede interaction with, and in my case, it impeded interaction with the service delivery system. Often hospice would want to come in, and they were fabulous. I loved hospice, but they would come in and want to do something. And I would have this moment of just kind of sheer panic because I felt like that was my job. That was my sister. I wanted to do that for her myself. So in some cultures, there may be more of a focus on family. You probably have worked with cultures where people focus more on family and having family take care of family, like in my case. And that can be really challenging if a person has a different value from their family, or if the parents have a different set of values than the person themselves has. So often these create those barriers to services and supports. And there's simply a cultural overlay there that we have to consider to help navigate that. So if we look at the person in the setting of their family group and who they are in their membership in the group that they feel they belong to in terms of whatever culture we're talking about here, a person-centered approach really encourages us to slow down and get to know the person on an individual level within that family group, within the context of the larger group that they feel they belong to, which can tell us a lot about the culture of the individual person. So we have to dig deeper to discover the beliefs and the values and the preferences of every person that we serve and support. And it starts with conversation, just like all of our person-centered practices do, navigating with openness, navigating with curiosity, and being curious about the person and how they see things, wanting to learn from them. All right, just checking here in chat, making sure everybody is okay. Looks good. All right. We also have talked just or touched on several times cultural humility, and to discover culture, it starts with cultural humility. In other words, anytime there's a relationship between a person who is maybe providing services and supports and a person being served, we are in that provider role, we are likely to have a better outcome if we're being culturally humble within our conversations and our actions. And cultural humility oftentimes turns us as experts into learners, and the person being served and supported into an expert of themselves.
No, doctor, want to be doctor.
I will ask you to check your microphones and just make sure that your microphone is red. I'm hearing a little bleed through. You may not want us to hear your conversation, so just make sure you have clicked your microphone so that it is on mute. So in addition, there were two researchers, Ella Green Mouton and Meredith Minkler, who did some work around cultural humility, and they talked about it as a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and to self-critique. And what they were really interested in doing was addressing the imbalances in power that exist and developing partnerships that benefit everyone within communities on behalf of individuals and groups as well. So Mouton uses both. She uses cultural competence and cultural humility. And she recognizes that it's a lifelong journey without end. She also views cultural humility as a more spiritual characteristics. And she said this is really drawing on the ability to stay humble and stay in a state of selflessness. Minkler, on the other hand, talked about experiences of learning about herself and challenging her own beliefs. And she tells a story about being at an event, a sporting event where the national anthem was playing, and she's a white woman. She took a knee during that playing of the national anthem. Actually, it was a military sporting event, and she assumed that there were two African-American people next to her, and she assumed that they would do the same thing, and they didn't take a knee. And she was really willing to learn why they chose to not take a knee, which had more to do with the fact that they were both of a military culture. And what she learned was in military culture that was considered for both of them to be disrespectful, and what taking a knee might mean to different people within different cultures about, what was more important to them. So she had that openness to learning. And that's one of the great lessons I think about being culturally humble or having cultural humility, is opening ourselves to the learning that comes when we ask questions about the differences that we're seeing from that place, using that mnemonic, remember, assess. So making it a safe environment to ask those questions and understanding about those differences and the way people really wish to express themselves. It requires, I think, some bravery, and it also requires us to be able to self-critique or challenge our own beliefs or our values or ideas. So we have to have that desire to pause just long enough to look inside ourselves and learn more about ourselves. And both of that start with the self, and it's going to bring a greater understanding to the content of our own characters and the benefits or returns on the long-term positive relationships that we have, like our client-provider relationships, right? So we should take some time here to understand what it means to self-critique, because I think that's a hard one for most of us. It could be as simple as just preparing before a short conversation or after a planning meeting. So thinking through the cultural aspects or the cultural lens that you'd like to apply. We might ask someone whose opinion we trust. I actually have someone that I frequently call if I have a question that's more cultural in nature. I have someone that I can call and I can just really be myself with and talk about either what my experience was or what I was thinking. And she's a great sounding board for me in those cases. So she gives me feedback on something that I've experienced, and it also helps give me some ideas about how to learn about myself or how to change my learning. And in addition, we may find that we need other ways to help us with self-reflection, like maybe a short mindfulness practice. I know some people engage in that, or meditation to focus our attention inside on ourselves so that we have better clarity about what we believe and how it's impacting that relationship that's in front of us. So let's talk a little bit about where that comes from. What impacts cultural humility is implicit bias. And implicit biases are attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. And this means it happens without us knowing it. So these biases, which include both the positive and the negative, so favorable and unfavorable conclusions, are happening in the moment, and they're usually without our awareness or any intentional control. So we're going to talk about what that grows out of in just in a moment. So in other words, implicit bias is not done on purpose, and we all have it. So a stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. So I'll just give you one about women because I'm a woman. Women are nurturing. But I know many women who are not. Or all dog owners treat their pets like full-fledged members of their family. So you've heard these stereotypes. Earlier, I asked you to share some of the cultural groups that we belong to. So we had people who said they were part of alumni groups or sorority groups or fraternity groups. Think about that activity, and let's expand that to talk a little bit about implicit bias. If you think about one of those groups that you belong to and name a stereotype that's often made about that group. So I'm thinking about things like, many of you said you were a part of a sports group. So sporty people are all in shape. Or sorority members. Sorority members are just into their appearance. Those are the kinds of things I want you to kind of think about. So have you heard stereotypes or experienced stereotypes for those groups? Remember that those can be both positive, they can be negative, and I'd like you to associate those stereotypes with one of the groups you mentioned earlier. So could you put a few of those in chat for us? There were moms groups, there were reading groups, running groups, all kinds of things, church groups, faith-based things. So what are some of the stereotypes that might connect to those groups? These do not have to be things you believe. They do not have to be things you believe. Opinionated. So Tungi, I am not sure what groups you were associating that with, but apparently opinionated is one of the stereotypes. Religious. So faith-based groups might be religious. I'm not sure. Oh, okay. So Tungi, as the president of the family reunion, you're opinionated. You have a lot of opinions. Okay. Never available, the motherhood group. So for religious, yes, that was the faith or church group. Yeah, Cajuns are thought to be people who are kind of always dancing and love music and love food. Those are absolutely true for me, but it's not true for all of my Cajun friends. Sorority members are into exclusivity. All fraternities love to haze their member. Sororities are arrogant. Yeah, okay, so very good. You get the idea there. Retired veterans are typically considered forgotten by the country. Yes. So if you think about that, I want you to decide, and you don't have to put this in chat, but I want you to decide if that's true for you or not, and decide whether or not that stereotype is positive or negative. I think that's often something that we find ourselves exploring when we're working around culture and thinking about our biases, our own values, where those come from. Often those attitudes or stereotypes are kind of part of that implicit bias, right? They are unconscious, they come from way back. And they can be positive or negative. They can also impact how we engage with others. So let's keep moving and think a little bit about some of the key characteristics of implicit biases. Thank you for including that in chat. And I told you it could feel like a little sensitive, because my guess is probably more often than not, what we think about is the negative aspects of the stereotype, not necessarily the positive aspect. So thinking about the key characteristics of cultural bias, implicit biases are common, and everyone has them, as I said, even people who are professionally required to not have them. So people like judges and mediators have them. We all have them, and it's okay, because as human beings, that's how each of us sees the world and the people in it. It's when those implicit biases are left unchecked, when we don't examine them or think about what they mean or where they came from, where they're not examined, where they're not critiqued for ourselves, that we find ourselves in a place where it's difficult for person-centered cultural humility to grow. Implicit and explicit biases are related to, so they're related to one another. So one doesn't cancel out the other. Explicit biases are known as the obvious stereotypes and attitudes we hold, and implicit biases are not known or obvious to us, making them harder for us to see. But both implicit and explicit biases are related to and can strengthen one another. So we generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group, though we can still hold implicit biases against the groups which we belong to. So we might think something bad of those groups as well, or something negative. And the good news is that we can change implicit bias over time. Our brains can change, we can unlearn things, and there are lots of different methods for that. And we'll give you a few tips on that as we move through the rest of the material. One of the people I train with often tells a story about her coworker who was supporting someone who was African American in a person-centered community, and they were doing community support building. And he said that one of the things that really helped him think about biases and how overwhelming these conversations could be is he's not necessarily looking to embrace the person's whole ethnic cultural group as much as he was looking to get to know that one person on an individual level, the person he was working with. And that made the prospect of being culturally humble, at least from the perspective of getting to know the person, much less intimidating and much more possible. So it puts aside some of those things that are grander in nature, and it helps us really think about, as I think, what sits on the person's heart. How do we get to know that person individually? All right. Biases may evolve into part of our personal value system as well. And that begins very early in our lives. I'm going to go through the points here, and I want you to think about your own values while I'm doing this and where they came from. And maybe drop a few of those things in chat about what's coming up for you about your own values. As human beings, we have our own values and our beliefs and attitudes that we've developed through the course of our lives. The family we have, friends, community that we live in, the experiences that we've had over the course of our lives have all contributed to our sense of who we are and how we view the world. Basically, your core values are the things that are most important to you, the most deeply held, the most highly cherished ideals. Those can usually be stated in one word, like freedom or equality or justice. And core values help define who you are as a person, but probably the most important thing they do for you is they function to guide your daily decision making and your daily behavior. So they're how you make decisions about what you will do all day long, every day. So the roots of it, really, where your core values come from, triggers that age-old question about nature versus nurture. And it's likely that you came with, there is a lot of research that says that babies are actually born into the world with values. You have some core values, but they get shaped over the course of growing up. So the influence of the people who first cared for you, in my case, that was my parents, but you may have been cared for by someone else early in your life. But without question, our first caregivers are the most important influence on our core values. Much of who you are gets developed during those years between birth and 3 years old. And the people that you spent the most time with at that point of your life had a great influence on you. You heard them say things, you saw them do things, and that probably influenced you very deeply. And you probably still hold those values today. For most of us, we do. So I wonder about the people who influenced you first. And in my case, my parents. I can even hear the words like integrity, honesty, reliability. I hear those in my dad's voice because that was something he was always kind of preaching on. Especially my father, really instilled that value in me. And it was one that got reinforced through the course of my year. There were significant other adults in your life. And it could be teachers, maybe coaches, grandparents, pastors, etc. Your friends' parents. You were impacted by their words. You were impacted by their behavior. And you either unconsciously modeled yourself after them or away from them. One of my earliest memories of another adult really having an impact on my value was a teacher who told me I was an artist when I was very young. I was probably 6 or 7 years old. And that influence of that first art teacher in my life to recognize and draw that out in me has stuck with me all my life. And I really value creativity as a result of that. And I'm almost certain that I can pinpoint the moment when I heard that. The media, things that you see on television, on social media, they can really, that stuff can really influence what we begin to value. Your friends and peers, how many of you don't have to raise your hand to this, but how many of you had friends when you were in high school and your mom or dad said something like, I really don't like it when you hang out with so-and-so? That's usually an indication that the values that they're seeing emerge are in conflict with the values of your family. And life experiences. So what happens in your life impacts your core values, whether that's positive or negative, and how you handle those experiences, how the people around you handle those experiences also has an impact. I think about this often. I know sadly there was in the past week this terrible set of tornadoes or string of tornadoes in Mississippi. And there's been bad weather kind of all over our country. And this happens all the time, right? Every few months or something big and devastating like that happens. I think the whole reason that I'm a social worker is that compassion, or really being able to connect with people who are suffering, be present with people who are suffering, emerged as one of my core values early in my life, because the town I lived in had been devastated by a hurricane. And I learned from compassionate examples of others, seeing each other help seeing people help one another, to be a compassionate person, and what impact that made on our life. So I was going to take a look and see what you said about values in chat. Did anything come up there? Mom and dad and sisters and brothers helping. So the last of 14. Oh my goodness, yes. Showing up for people who show up for you, not overextending yourself, and learning how to balance everything in life. Don't talk about it, be about it. Family is important, and so are your friends. Being true to self. Those are some really clear values, right? Those are ones that I actually really love reading and hope to emulate some of that in my own life. My values came from my parents. My value from my families with adjustment. Maternal grandmother instilled some values. Let's see what else. Humility you got from your maternal grandmother. I've learned from parents, friends, other family members. Very nice. So you very clearly are aware that these things come to you through your interaction over the course of your life. Let's think about how in our own heads we can get about it. I'm going to ask you to respond in chat to a set of questions here. This is this concept of 5 skandhas, and skandhas is a word that means groups or heaps. That's all it means. Is from Buddhist tradition, and it's sometimes helpful to participate in this. And you actually could like go back and do this with your colleagues now after doing this exercise. Often our views on things happen in an instant, and they come from way back. So if most of this stuff was set for us by the time we were about 3 years old, or a big amount of our values were set from way back, that means for me at least, I got to reach back pretty far to be able to access that. But it happens like in a split second. So the Buddhist would say that being present or creating presence in all of our experiences takes on the 5 sensations that you see here on the screen immediately. We're not even aware of the first 3. So form, emotion, sensation, perception, belief. Those are just unconscious and in us. The other 2 happen in a split second. So I want you to get your head around this by, if you are not driving, I'd like you to close your eyes. I'm going to read a statement and then ask you to open your eyes and tell me what just popped into your head. So you can put that part in chat. So close your eyes if you're not driving. And my first statement is, we're going to get 3 feet of snow. Now open your eyes and tell me what just popped into your head. You can put that in chat for me if you don't mind. We're going to get 3 feet of snow. Chill, snow day, boots, shovel, being comfy under covers, no school, snowmageddon. Yeah, cold, sleeping in. No school. Do I have enough food? Yes, we run out and get bread and milk, right? Joy. Yeah, so for some of us, it's like, yay, I'm out of work for the day. And for others of us, like, oh, I got to move all this snow, right? When I do this training in the north, like the upper Northeast, Maine or whatever, they're like, who cares? 3 feet of snow, no big deal, right? But for us in North Carolina, my goodness, I'd be peeping out the window for like a week, right? Snow, that's a lot. All right, let's try another one. I want you to close your eyes. You're up at the blackboard in 3rd grade. Now open your eyes and tell me what just popped into your head. Fear. I got this. Yikes. Math. Horrible sound of chalk. Got a lot of fearful and anxious. When can I sit down? Boy, a bunch of us have math trauma. Laughing. Do I know the answer to this math problem? How do I answer this question? Yeah. Let's try one more. This one will, oh, it's good memories for Gail. Why me, Rosemary? That was me. Please don't make me stand in front of the class. All right, so let's try one more. This one will be familiar probably to some of us. Close your eyes. This report has to be completely redone. What just popped into your head? Why? Oh, shikes. Shoot. Oh my gosh. By who? Tell me why? Right? Why me? Not a good feeling, right? Okay. Thank you so much for doing that. So I want you to think about that as you go into the next conversation with one another. But that image came to you like that. You were able to just really pull that feeling up. And it has to do with the experiences and the things that we value. What we're trying to avoid in any of those situations, whether we're standing at the blackboard or facing 3 feet of snow or having to report or rewrite a report, we have a ability or a choice to respond one way or another. So we're not our thoughts. We're not the things that pop into our heads. We are not our body. So those sensations like fear or anxiety that you felt, we're not our feelings. We're mad because you told us to rewrite that report. Those are the things that we experience. What we can do is take a pause and think about where that came from and examine that value before we move on to respond. All right, so let's try something together. You're probably tired of hearing me for a bit. Let's hear one another. we're going to ask you to go into a conversation with one another. And it's a simple conversation, really getting you to practice some of the things we've talked about in terms of cultural competency, by asking you to share something that you know. So Debbie is going to put you in groups of about 5 to 8. So I have a few things to say about this. It's tricky with large groups sometimes. I realize sometimes people's microphone is not working. Maybe your camera's not working. So I want you to do your best. Everybody can use chat. That's easy for everyone to use. So if you don't hear or see anything when you get into the breakout room, I want you to go to chat and talk with one another there, please. Because it's going to make for the best experience for you. I'd like you to share something you know how to do. Now, I'll tell you what people often will do in this conversation, and it's fabulous. I'm actually writing a cookbook based on this, the person-centered cultural humility cookbook. But share something you know how to do. So it might be a recipe. And often in our recipes, those come passed down from our family members. But it could be anything, planning a wedding, knowing how to play a sport, coaching a team, those kinds of things. And you're going to switch roles as you sit in this conversation with one another. So we're going to give you a total of I'm going to say 15 minutes to have this conversation. And it usually means that about 3 people can share something they know how to do. If you are not one of those people, I want you to listen in the conversation. So listen to the person sharing what they know how to do. And then I want the whole group to discuss or offer reflections about things that you heard that were important to the person. So truly, this is just a conversation where you're sharing something that you know how to do. But others, I want you to be listening for aspects of culture, things that sit on the person's heart, all the stuff that you would be doing in a typical conversation. So the first speaker will speak for about 5 minutes. We'll give you a reminder to change roles, the next speaker for about 5, the next speaker for about 5, and then we'll come back to the main room and discuss this together. So share something you know how to do in your breakout rooms. Debbie, is everyone set up to go to the breakout rooms?
Yes.
Okay. And if I'm remembering correctly, I know we have several interpreters with us. If you have a need to be in a specific room, either because you are using interpretation services or you are an interpreter, or for any other reason that you need to be in a specific room, we've allowed you to choose where you're going. So hopefully that eases it for everyone. I hope so. If you have any difficulties, I'll be in the main room. I'll help you get where you need to be. But I hope for now you'll just go enjoy your conversation with one another. So Debbie, you can open those rooms and you'll click the blue button that says join to go to your breakout room. Let me know if you have any difficulties. I'll help you get to where you need to be. Find the blue button that says join, click that and you will arrive in your breakout room.
I don't see the blue button.
Let's see, who was that? Vanessa, is that you?
Yes.
Let me see if I can find you and put you where you need to, where you can see that.
She's in room 6.
I don't see, oh, here we go. Vanessa, what I'm going to do is move you into a different room and let's see if a button pops up for you, okay? I'm moving you to room 2. Do you see a blue button that says join?
Hi, I accidentally got myself out of the, I think clicked something wrong and it pushed me out.
Is that Jennifer?
Yes,
Okay, let's see if we can find a spot for you. Hang tight.
I was in room 2.
Room 2. I am going to move you into, well, I don't see you, Jennifer.
She's in
Oh,
room
here, there you are. I'm going to move you into a different room, Jennifer. That's
Okay.
the easiest way to do that. Hang tight.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. You should see a join button.
Tanya, it's Yolanda. Can you put me in the room? I'm not seeing a join button.
Oh, yes, we can. Which room would you like to be in? Do you care?
Nope.
All right, here we go. Moving you to room 11. And I'm just,
Hey Tanya, how you doing? This is Mike Owens from MTS. How did I return to room number 2?
Room 2. Let me see if I can get you back there, Michael. Hang tight. So Michael, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to bounce you out of 2 into 1, and then I'm going to bounce you back to 2. So join when it says room 2, okay?
Okay.
Hang tight. Nice to see you, by the way. I think it's been a while. Let's see.
Yes, how you been?
Good. I hope you have too.
Yes, ma'am. Sure have.
All right, here you go to room 2.
Well, I got me in room 1 now. Okay, there you go. Thank you.
See you later.
All right.
I'm just checking in the main room. Naomi, Kimberly, Atem, Yemsarat. I'm so sorry. I bet I did not say that correctly, but if I can help you, Sinetra, Melvin, Gina, Mercy, Betty, Charles, Stephanie, Charles, Deborah, Paula, Prince. If I can help any of you get to where you need to be, please let me know. And otherwise, I'm going to assume you are where you need to be. So just let me know if there's anything I can do for you. Put it in chat or turn on your microphone. Let me know. I'm going to assign some of these unassigned folks. All right, welcome back. I think you're all back now. Let's do just a brief report out. I'm curious about a couple of things. So what you were doing, although I didn't say to you, I want you to practice reflective listening or active listening, which is really a cornerstone of practicing cultural humility. It's about listening, and we're really listening to hear what the person is saying and communicating, even underneath the words. So someone was telling you something that they know how to do. They're sharing something they know how to do. And I'm curious about what you heard, if you were a listener in your groups, about what was important to a person. Were there pieces of their culture that showed up in the things they do? Can you tell me a little bit about those conversations? And here I'm going to ask you to do one of 2 things. You can either turn on your microphone and just share that aloud, or you could put that in chat. So what were some of the things that you heard that were important to the person sharing something they know how to do, or maybe shared some aspect of their culture just from you listening? What did you learn? Turn on your microphone or put it in chat.
Tanya, this is Dr. Van Horn. I have an
Awesome.
example.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Van Horn, please go ahead.
So we had one person, Bola, describe in detail how she would make jollof rice, which is very common in her culture, which is Nigerian culture. And what clearly came through is she described how she is passing on this recipe to the next generation. And as she talked about the recipe, what was clear is she's making big portions of food. This is not just making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So it's clear that these recipes are centrally important to her culture, so much so that she's passing it on to the next generation. And that when people eat, it's a big group. The meal is the central element of holding the family together, and learning how to make these recipes is so important that she is teaching the next generation so that it's passed down. And I just heard coming through how important food is to holding the family together, and that how important the recipes are to be passed down to the next generation rather than leaving it to chance that these may get lost, in the family. And I wrote down everything that she said to do step by step, and I'm going to try it tonight.
Oh, excellent. I feel jealous. I want to try it too. But interestingly, Dr. Van Horn, what you picked up on were a number of things that we would say are important to the person, right? So family, you picked up on large pots of food, right? So making sure people are cared for. Many of us do that through food, or gathering large numbers of people together. So making sure that we have the people that we are connected to in our lives, and passing on that specific recipe. This is how we do it in my family or my culture or the place where I come from. So all of those things are apparent in just something as simple as sharing a recipe. And that's why I think doing like a cookbook, our culture shows up in our food all the time. Michael says they had a really good group in group 2. I'm going to back up just a little bit and see what else I see here. I saw someone said what came through for them. Oh, shoot, I lost the chat. 1 second. Whoops. As I go wacky fingers here in every direction. One person said passion is what came through for them. So Eva said creativity or beauty is something that many of us value. Yeah, and that may be a cultural value for us, and something that gets kind of passed to us from generation to generation. Not to start anything controversial, but we've had a whole week of listening to the debate about, is the Statue of David art? Is it pornography? That's a cultural, there's a cultural overlay there, right? So there's a lot going on with that particular conversation. I won't come down on either side of it. You can probably just guess. Family and food is important to several people. Advocacy, passion, values, beliefs, skills. Let's see, don't have to, sorry about that, it's rolling all over the place. Don't have to be a pro at something to teach it. Yes. All right. One was a ballerina and is now becoming a psychologist working on a PhD. Others love cooking anything, keeping the kitchen clean. Let's see. Another was a nurse, believes she does it well, and shared concerns about people leaving the field because of COVID. So I have a similar concern about people in the mental health field leaving in huge numbers. The reason I do therapy online is because I started it during COVID just kind of as a way to try to help. And then what I realized was so many people had left the field that I felt really compelled to try to make a difference and to just be there for the large number of people who were, struggling. The willingness to get someone's life better by sharing skills. Adventurous. So you heard all kinds of things in these conversations with others, stuff that set on people's hearts. Really helped us understand who that person was at that core. And I appreciate that. I'm going to ask you, you're going to have another conversation coming up here before too terribly long. I think that is where the bulk of our learning happens, is with one another. But I'm going to ask you to continue to practice those active listening skills. That's what you were doing. So listening for the cultural components, listening for those things that are important to someone. And we do that because we're listening for understanding. And that is one of our basic tenets of person-centered practices. And really getting accustomed to just building that into every conversation. So again, these aren't new person-centered skills we're using to learn how to have a conversation that includes culture. We're having our typical conversations with people using all those same listening skills, person-centered skills that we would use, but we're keeping culture in mind. We're thinking about our own values. We're thinking about what we don't know and what we can ask, or how we can use that mnemonic, assess, to be present with people in such a way that makes them comfortable in sharing those aspects of culture. Anything else anyone would like to say before I move on? Any other experiences or thoughts, or something that you learned in your breakout room that you'd just like to share?
You come to find out that different people do the same thing you do, because we was in group number 2. One guy was discussing how he seasons food, and when he came from Africa, he had to learn to tone it down because of the spiciness. And I love cooking. Dee, she sings, and I know Dee personally, and I sing also. One lady discussed how versus using formula, she did the natural child feeding thing. which is not practiced a whole lot in this environment in the USA. And how it'd be natural, like over in Africa, where people don't believe in covering up because it's like natural. But we had a real good discussion, and one guy was talking about writing a book of spirituality stuff. And I know Dee is spiritual, I'm spiritual, and the other lady was, I mean, everybody pretty much in the group was shaking their head like they was in church. So we had some real good discussions, and I was like, wow, too bad it was cut short because Laura was about to chime in. I'm like, oh man, right on time. We just got to check out. So it was pretty interesting. I was waiting for Laura though.
Well, Michael, we are going to go back into breakout rooms before too long, and maybe if I can figure it out, if I talk less, you all can talk more. So maybe we'll give Laura a chance. We'll put you back in the same groups.
It was just
Looking
getting
forward
good.
to it. Looking forward to it.
Well, and so Michael, you point out something that is really important for us to remember. First of all, it highlights what Ella Green Mouton said about it's almost like a spiritual practice when we are really practicing cultural humility. It's a commitment to be that blank slate, that egolessness. And the thing that you hit on over and over is I'm connected to this person through this. I'm connected to this person through that. So that connection is really powerful, and that builds trust. And it also builds just kind of a warmth in our interactions with one another. It doesn't mean that just because we both are people of faith, or we both are people who like our food spicy, that we know exactly how the other person does it and what they want, but it means we have something to kind of as a central point for both of us to connect to, and that connects us to one another. So I think that's a great conversation. I wish I had been in that one too.
And we actually prompted Dee into singing one of them songs, and I almost fell out.
You were even singing in your group?
No, she was singing a gospel song, and like, you know, you could tell like when it touches somebody because we all was quiet and we was like staring at the screen.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that. That sounds like a wonderful experience, and I'm glad that you had an enjoyable conversation with one another. And we will go back and talk with one another again here in just a moment. All right, so I'm going to move us along. Was there anything that I missed? Did I hear someone beginning to talk as I was moving? All right, I'll move us along and we'll get you back into breakout rooms as quickly as we can, because I know that you are enjoying that. I do think it's also important for us to think about how those biases that exist in our system and ourselves influence an approach that any of us may have to supports and services. And if you think about who are the major contributors in developing services and supports for people with disabilities, where people live in their communities, in their neighborhoods, who knows best? Have there been shifts over time? What are our own preconceived judgments and perceptions? Absolutely. All of this comes into play. So there are service disparities that we are addressing in our system constantly. I'm actually doing this, kind of hit me last week. I won't say which state, but I'm doing an assessment of the system in a state around people accessing services and supports. And it really isn't about disparity. But what I very quickly understood is it has to be about disparity, because if a complete assessment includes these 8 pieces, and I know that people of a certain culture may not have these 2 routinely, simply because, I've practiced a long time and I understand that, and people of a different culture may not have these other 3, then those cultures automatically get left out of services and supports. They don't qualify simply because they'll never have a complete package. And are we addressing that? And that becomes really important in our services and supports. And we also have to think about how the structure of the system has historically been, and I don't mean us in this room, first of all, I don't want you to take it that way, but historically, the way the system was built is that the service delivery system knows best. That's a bias that really we're operating, I wouldn't say from, but often against. Some of us may be operating from that, but many of us are operating against this. And the shift that I think is helpful for us to consider is that the person knows best. And we thought about that together when we looked at the culture of one. People who feel heard or seen, no matter where they are on their path, are automatically going to be more willing to share from their perspective what represents balance. So this has a lot to do with people's own lived experience and feeling valued. There was a Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire, who was a popular education proponent, meaning that popular education is people-oriented, it is people-guided, and it's an approach to education that really sources from the people. I think of it as crowdsourced education is a nice way to think about it. But when we did the exercise just now of sharing something that we know how to do, it could have been knowledge gained from generational learning, like I think it's Jaffa rice. Or it could be learning about how to make a family recipe or something learned in a traditional setting. We can look at the interaction between a person and the person receiving services and supports as an exercise in cultural humility. So if we center our focus on that person's life experiences, the approach really helps us affirm the dignity of all people, and it really recognizes that everyone in the space where they are, in the developmental stage where they are, in whether it's an administrative office, whether it's a doctor's office or a community, we are all teachers and we are all learners. And so it kind of has this way of making the interaction more, for lack of a better word, egalitarian, equal, to really stand side by side with one another and learn together. So if we think about the shifts that have happened in time, about the biases in our service delivery system, one of the more frequent or the more recent ones for all of us was the movement for Black Lives that was born out of the grassroots Black Lives Matter movement. And there have been shifts in that movement over a very, it's been going on for a long time, but over the last few years, that movement has shifted several times. And there have long existed standing organizations that believe in civil and human rights for African Americans and other people of color, but it has shifted dramatically in the last few years based on the work of those groups. So another example of how shifts and biases have occurred in our understanding of how we know people is really when we think about neurodiversity. Think about how much we talk about that in our field now, or the range of differences in the way individuals' brains work. And how we think about behavioral traits of human beings, especially in people with autism, is where a lot of this work has been done. And now there is a belief that most of us hold that these differences are variation in the human brains, and they're not deficits or something that someone is lacking. So that's a shift that has impacted our field. And there's many, many more examples of this that probably all could come up with if we tried. Not to mention that a lot of these shifts and biases now include acceptance that a lot of cultures intersect with one another. So we talk about intersectionality when we talk about culture now as well. And that's kind of a new concept, new in the last, I would say, 10 years in our field. Not that it hasn't been known prior to that, but it's something that we are focusing on more intently now than we have in the past. So we have to be aware of what our preconceived notions are and the judgments and the perceptions that we may have that cloud our ability to practice cultural humility. But we also have to understand how the system is designed and what are the shifts that need to continue to happen in our system to make things more so that we can have more cultural humility just in our services and supports as well. I'll move on to talk a little bit, and this, as I said, we're not going to practice deeply a person-centered skill, but we are going to talk about how person-centered skills can help us be more culturally humble in our practice on a daily basis. So when we're practicing person-centered skills from a cultural standpoint, what we're trying to do is support inclusion and really embrace diversity. So we include that in our planning process. We include that in understanding where people live and who they are with on a daily basis. So it considers that whole person in the context of their culture, in the context of their strengths and of the things that give them purpose and meaning. And it helps us operate from a place of not one size fits all. So there's no one right way to do things. We are supporting the whole person. And an extremely important focus of person-centered discovery is learning about the person in the context of the culture that they feel a part of. Because we are all diverse cultural beings who wish to be included in ways that work for us in the communities that we choose to be a part of and in our lives, it's important that we start with this framework in mind, really thinking about who the person is at their core, who they are in the context of the culture that they feel a part of, because we all bring to our work, not only our unique strengths, but we bring gifts and skills and our culture and our identity and all of that with us in the work that we do, because we are cultural beings as human beings. So we want to make sure that as we use our person-centered practices, we've examined our values. We have that practice of self-critique, self-reflection. We have people that we can receive feedback from about our practices if we feel that would be helpful to us. That we are really paying attention to being that blank slate and learning from the other person what their perspective is. Some of the skills that might be particularly useful to you in learning about culture, and these probably won't come as a surprise if you use a lot of person-centered practices in your daily work, are things that we use to discover about the person. So what helps the person have a good day? What creates a bad day for the person? What's a typical day look like? So that typical day skill is one that we would often find ourselves really using with a cultural lens applied. Relationship maps are a natural. Who are the people who are in the person's life? How do they bring purpose and meaning to the person's life? What do they know about the person? Remember that different people know different things about the person because of how they're in their life. So a relationship map may help us match people to people providing services and supports. It may also help us understand who creates better days for the person. So the skills may actually work together. Rituals and routines is another natural skill to talk about culture in. So you talked about rituals about food. Some of you, probably the foods that you were creating might be for holidays. I know for my family, it's just not Christmas if hot tamales aren't on the table. I'm from Louisiana. You wouldn't think hot tamale first, but that is one of the things that's very culturally a part of Louisiana Christmas is hot tamales. And so that in and of itself gives you an opportunity to ask the person questions and learn more about the culture of the person that you're talking to. And then obviously matching is another one where cultural overlays would be a really important part of the conversation. So again, the same skills you're very accustomed to using, I'll just share them here. Usually the discovery skills would be the ones that we would rely on more when we're talking about culture, because those are about learning about who the person is at their core and getting to know the person and the desired balance between the things that sit on their heart, so what's important to them, and the things that they need to be healthy and safe, what's important for them. But we may also learn things that are cultural in nature from things like our everyday learning, where we are interacting with people on a daily basis and learning from those, hopefully learning from those interactions and making sure that shows back up in the plan. And then management skills, which are not simply skills that managers use. Those are about managing our roles in a person's life. So matching would be a very natural skill for learning about a person's culture, because you might learn who a person would best receive services and supports for, what's likely to make for more successful interactions with a person. So I just remind you of these. We won't go deeply into any of these skills, and we use the skill reflection sheet to remind you of the skills that you've already practiced And also, if you have conversations coming up where you'd like to think about culture in the context of that, I would ask you just to print the skill reflection sheet. Think about how you might explore culture with someone you're working with through the use of the person-centered skills. Again, they're not just for people who are using services and supports. We can do this inside our organizations, in our families, in our communities, and you've certainly thought of a lot of that together in the time that you've been together. And I want to say one more thing about the skill reflection sheet. These are available at the Learning Community website. They're also available at the SDA website. Both of those are linked at the end of this presentation. I always encourage people just to print those off so that they have copies of them for wherever they do their work. And Debbie has very thoughtfully put those in the chat for you. If you want to just download them right now, you can absolutely do that as well. But I find these to be helpful, particularly when I'm feeling stuck. I might take a glance at the skill reflection sheet and it reminds me, oh, I do have a skill I should try in this particular situation. I keep these handy all the time, and I've been using person-centered skills for more than 20 years at this point, but it's just nice to remember, you know, to try things out particularly when a conversation is coming up. So I want you to go into your breakout rooms again, and I do think we can give you just a little more time than I was anticipating so that Laura can tell her story to Michael and the rest of the group. But we want to think about when we have found ourselves using cultural humility. That's what the focus of this conversation is going to be. You've likely had to use cultural humility when you're supporting someone. You may not have called it that, but you probably have found yourself using it. So if you can recall a time that you did, that's what I'd like your conversation to be about. So be as specific as you can. How did you convey dignity? How did you convey respect? Was it challenging? And I'm going to ask you to share that in your breakout rooms. Now, I have to tell you a story myself. When I was very young social worker, I wasn't even out of school yet. I was probably in my early 20s. I had a friend who was from Iran, and she was about 10 years older than me. So she had a daughter who was turning 1 year old. And the 1 year old birthday culturally for people who are Iranian is a big birthday. And my friend explained it that like in history, in past history, many babies didn't survive the first year of their life. So that birthday was on par with what we would think of as like a US wedding. Like it's a big deal, bands, presents, you know, you name it. And it lasted really over the course of like 3 days at my friend's home. So I was very honored to receive an invitation to Pune's birthday. And I was excited because my friend, a lot of her family had come from Iran in the 80s. This was, if you remember kind of culturally and historically what was going on politically at that time, there were supporters of the Shah and supporters of the Ayatollah, and there was a lot of immigration during the 80s. There was not a lot of understanding of Middle Eastern culture in the US, and that may in fact still be true. But my girlfriend invited me to come to this party, and she was really getting me prepped for what I might experience. So a lot of her family was going to be there. They had moved from Iran to England to Texas to Louisiana, and that's where we were at this point. So they had experienced culture outside of Iran, but many of them were still very culturally Iranian. And so she told me all the things I should do and all the things I should say and who I should kiss first and et cetera and et cetera. And so I spent a lot of time, I would say, becoming culturally competent about being with an Iranian family for a first birthday. And remember, that's about what I didn't know. So learning the things, being open-minded to that experience, trying to understand all the things that I might experience at that party. And when I was there, we were in the living room listening to music, and there were some dancers there, and it was just such a lovely time. The food was incredible. I crossed my legs, and the bottom of my foot was pointing at my girlfriend's mother, so the grandmother of the baby, who was turning 1 year old. And her mother became very upset with me. And my friend explained that was an insult. And that, you know, the fact that the bottom of my foot was facing her was really insulting and their culture. And she knew that it wasn't intentional on my part of those kinds of things, but her mother really didn't understand that I did not intend it. So I was asked to leave the party, which was a heartbreaking experience, but it also has been one of the deeper blessings, I guess, of my career, in that I can't know everything I don't know. So probably with a little bit more experience, I could have had a different conversation with her mom. I was very sorry and apologetic and those kinds of things. And her mom was also kind of a hard person, so she was not going to flex much in her beliefs. But also, I shouldn't expect someone to flex in their beliefs. And so I couldn't know what I didn't know. And you may run afoul sometimes, make mistakes in supporting someone when culture is one of the things that we're taking into consideration. So what do we do when that happens? We want to make sure that we fail forward. And I'll talk with you a little bit about that later in the training, to apply that going forward. It doesn't mean that I know everything there is to know about every culture I'm ever going to support. I am going to make mistakes. How I handle that at that time, if you remember back to the skandhas, you know, we are not our thoughts, we are not our actions, we are not our bodies, but we are the things we choose to do. So how I take time to not only learn from that experience, but apply it to my future experiences is a very important part of having person-centered cultural humility. Checking on here. Yeah, so very interesting how people around the world respond, how we represent ourselves. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to ask you to go into a conversation with one another. I told you I would get off on a tangent occasionally, but I want you to go into a conversation with one another about using cultural humility yourselves. It can be things that you're particularly proud of. It can be things that were challenging for you. Remember that we don't want anyone feeling in any way uncomfortable or overwhelmed. That was one of our meeting agreements. So obviously, if there's something that you do not feel comfortable sharing, just don't share it. But I want you to have this conversation with one another about a time you had to use cultural humility, either in your work life or your personal life. What are some of the things you noticed about yourself when you were supporting that person or interacting with that person? How did you show dignity? How did you show respect? Just be as specific as you can. And let's try to get through as many conversations as we can in 20 minutes, please. So that should give you time to pick up on anything from the last conversation you didn't get to say and add it to this conversation as well. So we'll see you back here in 20 minutes. Debbie's going to open the rooms. I'll watch out for anybody who needs any assistance getting where they need to be. I see that those rooms are open now. So go ahead and click join and find your partners. All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope that conversation was as enjoyable as the first, and that you shared some things that you have experienced in terms of cultural humility, and wondering if anybody would care to share their experiences. As you know, you can put that in chat. You can also turn on your microphone if you'd like to just speak. Anybody have any examples of when they found themselves using cultural humility or when it could have come in handy?
Tanya, it's Dr. Van Horn. I have an example.
Thank you.
So, you know, our framework is person-centered, but in many of our families, the family unit is the center. And what the individual person's preferences are not the center. And then sometimes you have to reconcile that discrepancy. What do we do when the family unit is more valued than the person's individual preferences? Who do we talk to? Who do we pay attention to? Who do we listen to?
Absolutely. And that is a consideration, whether or not we're thinking about it from a cultural lens, actually. How do we keep the person in the center of the conversations when the value may often be family centric rather than person centered? That could be unique to an individual family, I guess is what I mean by that. Anyone else? Cultural humility and how you found yourself using it, or when you found yourself using it. I'm checking in chat too. I see some things coming in there. Okay. A quiet group. I get it. People are very, very busy.
I will go. I'm shy, but I'll go.
Thank you, Gloria. I know we will enjoy hearing what you have to say.
I will share something that Mr. White shared in our group. I thought it was amazing. The culture humility shock that he experienced at his workplace, where he said he loved mopping his work area, and that was therapeutic for him as well. But they had a new hire whose culture was you do not see a supervisor or someone older than you do something like that, mop his office space. So he was minding his business, mopping his area, and this person came in and saw him, and he was in a shock and grabbed the mop from him and started mopping and actually pointed at him like as a warning that you shouldn't do this. You're my supervisor, I should be doing this. So that was a shock for him, but he said he enjoyed the experience, the person helping him to mop. It just took the therapeutic part of it from him.
Very nice, Gloria, and a wonderful example of that. Thank you so much. And you did a very nice job sharing that too. Gloria, I'm sorry.
No, I said thank you.
So a very similar story. I was, my in-laws have now passed away, but this has been several years ago. I was at a restaurant with my in-laws and we were waiting in the entry area where the benches are, where you wait for a table. And it was, I think it was Easter, actually. It was, kind of that time of year where all the ladies were walking in their Easter finery and the little kids were all dressed up. And I was sitting on the bench beside my mother-in-law, and someone walked in and I popped up because it was very, very crowded. Like a holiday is always crowded at a restaurant. I popped up off the bench to offer my seat to someone. And my mother-in-law started laughing and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, because I was taught when I was younger that if someone who is older than you is standing, you better not be sitting. And that is like one of those things that's really ingrained. I do it on buses, on like wherever I am. You can't do it on the airplane very much, right? Because you're assigned a seat, but definitely something that it has stayed with me. And my mother-in-law said, "How did you know she was older than you?" I was like, "I just made an assumption." But we find ourselves doing that, and that's a value we carry from way back. There was a conversation about a staff member having an unpleasant odor, and it happened to me twice, and another person had had the same experience. Yeah. So sometimes these things bond us. It's kind of like what makes us human, right? And one of the things we can do is practice humility when we experience that, and just remembering some of our good person-centered skills, but also just our good human skills, our good reflective listening skills may help us navigate those situations that can feel a little tricky. Anyone else? Anything about practicing cultural humility when you wished you would have practiced cultural humility, something that you saw that impressed you, either negatively or positive? Yes, go ahead.
I have something. I heard you read something that probably was written in the comment where it says, for instance, someone is experiencing being around a coworker that had extremely high odor, and you're probably not accustomed to that person's culture. But I've encountered years ago where I was working alongside another female, and she had an extremely high odor. But they're Africans, and my boss, she was African too. But I didn't know how, because I didn't want that person to feel like I'm trying to be rude or I'm humiliating her. So I spoke to my boss because we had a good relationship. And my boss told me that in some of the countries, every villages, they have their different belief. She said she was from one where are not, they are accustomed, but they don't practice the new way of life. She said she smell it, but she wants to smell it. So I said, it's a good thing I didn't say anything because I would be just, intruding on her belief and her way of living.
So Kimberly, what you're talking about is practicing that pause, right? So our person-centered practices, and just our good skills in being present with other people alerted you to the fact that slowing down and kind of exploring before you approach that situation was the right thing to do. And I think often we may find ourselves in that situation where we want to know, we want to say something, but slowing down might actually be a better tact. And so you were able to engage others in the conversation who had a different perspective on it than one you had.
Yeah. But the boss, she wasn't with it still. She spoke to her and she told her that it's civil time and now she's running a business and she's the face front of the business. And when clients come, they're expecting to have a pleasant smell, wherein if they smell us smelling like that, they're going to think we're going to allow their parents to be like that.
So a conversation was had then in that situation.
Yeah.
I worked with a social worker. This was at a very large managed care organization she was in one of my training classes, and she said that I can't remember what culture she was from. It was a country in Africa, but she said that when she first came to the US and she had been practicing social work maybe 5 years or so, she said one of her colleagues took her aside and very politely said to her, "You've got to quit saying that people are fat." And she said the context of that was when she would see someone that she hadn't seen in a while, she'd say, "Oh, you look so fat, you look so beautiful." And she said, in my culture, that is absolutely one of the best compliments you can get. It means you're healthy and that you're living well, that things are going well for you. And she said that it was being taken very negatively by a number of people that she said to, both her colleagues and the clients that she worked with. So sometimes we do something out of our own culture, not knowing that it might have a different feel for the person who's receiving. All right, so I am going to move on. I wish we could stay in this conversation a little bit longer. And there was a comment in the chat, and I don't want to gloss over it, about, and I'm assuming this is about the odor conversation. Do we put up with it? And what Kimberly said was someone in the context of the work that the person does had a conversation with this person about the expectation in an American office building, an office, in the work that we do now. So someone was, that required bravery, I'm sure, because Kimberly's comment was also, and I felt I didn't want to offend her. And I would have absolutely felt that way myself. I would have felt very worried about offending someone to bring up that situation with them. Sometimes it requires some bravery on our part, right? All right, so we're moving ahead. I thank you so much for your honesty, for your forthrightness, for your vulnerability in these conversations, because there is nothing that is easy sometimes when we're navigating situations that are new to us. I want to just share with you what I think can be helpful in a framework for continuing to learn and continuing to practice person-centered cultural humility. And it's really about creating space to learn new information, but also to get rid of information that's not serving us. So unlearning misinformation is a part of our task. And to identify and work through the limited thinking that we may be engaging in ourselves. So if we are doing things like stereotyping, and we all do these things, we kind of mentioned that through the conversation today, or scapegoating or making assumptions, how can we identify that and work through it to move out of our comfort zones? Because we stay in our comfort zones because they're comfortable. They're just not places of great growth. So how can we put ourselves in the best position to learn And one of the things that several of us mentioned was, we sometimes make mistakes when we're learning, and how can we fail forward and add to our knowledge, not only of the other person, but of how to approach our work from a person-centered cultural standpoint in general. And though I won't ask you to sign anything, I think it's helpful to have a code of conduct around culture. So to ascribe to a person-centered cultural humility code of conduct, you might find yourself developing attitudes around appreciating and welcoming cultural diversity, acknowledging and accepting that the way that you see the world personally is sprinkled with your own upbringing. It's sprinkled with your own native culture. But others have, we have to empathize with others who have a way of being and a way of doing that may be different from ours. And knowing that that is sprinkled with their upbringing, sprinkled with their background as well. And that we are in the best frame of mind, that blank slate situation, when we maintain a sense of curiosity and respect and understanding for the other person's background, so that we can better serve and support them. That is what we are in the world to do. And then finally, to continue to be open-minded, so not stereotyping, scapegoating, or making assumptions about the person, really picking up those practices that help us shed some of the thinking that is not helpful for us. And I will ask you to end our time together with one final conversation just in our main group together. And then I have some resources to share with you after this. You can use the chat to answer these questions, or you can turn on your microphone. But if we're going to be person-centered, it really starts with us. We have to do things differently. We have to be targets of change, as well as creating change in the work we do. So what is it that specifically and realistically you can take away from our time together today that's going to help you be more culturally aware and informed in your person-centered practices? So what specifically you're going to do? What realistically are you going to do? Are one of you going to go back and do the 5 SCANDAs exercise, where you talk about getting 3 feet of snow with your colleagues, just to kind of open up the conversation and thinking about how automatic our thoughts are? Give examples about the ideas and the skills that we talked about here today that can help you be more culturally sensitive. All of that because there is an expectation in the HCBS rule that we practice from a culturally sensitive standpoint, that we include elements of culture in our person-centered planning. So practically, how are you going to do that? And in what ways will becoming more informed about cultural humility help in balancing important to and important for with people? So I'll ask you to think about all these questions in their totality, but I think the kind of crux of all of it is, what are you going to do with what you learned today? And if you will, just turn on your microphone or put it in chat for us, please. I see listening more, because sometimes input is giving to some versus waiting for the conversation to end, so that we can jump in and say what we have to say, right? Yeah. Give too soon. Yes, we jump in too quickly. Thank you, Michael, for clarifying that. What else? What are you going to practically do with the information that we shared here today? Anything you want to try as a result of the conversations you had?
This is Naomi. I would say more so being more compassionate and sensitive.
To be more compassionate and sensitive. Thank you, Naomi.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Dion says having more patience and whoops, it starts scrolling and I can't follow. Hang on a second. Having more patience and ask more questions. Yeah, I think we sometimes hesitate because we are concerned that we might run afoul of something that we don't know, make a mistake in our approach to someone, and we don't want to do that. I think we don't make these mistakes because we're bad people. Generally, we make these mistakes out of not knowing, and I think often we need to really kind of reflect on that and see how we can apply it forward. I see listen more to respond and pay attention. I do see patience. Don't assume. Ask questions to clarify. Ask more questions. Forgive me, it is scrolling quickly, so, and my scrolling skills are just not what they should be. Listening and allowing others to teach us, making it okay to make mistake and have courageous spaces of conversation and understanding. Oh, Tanya, I love that. Courageous spaces of conversation and understanding. I
I
might
don't
have
know
to-
if I'm allowed to get back.
What's that, Vanessa?
No, I was just saying, I lost that, someone that called, and I'm trying to get back.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Listen more closely and be mindful before speaking. Listen. So a lot of us agree that listening more, listening to understand will be helpful. Listening to what's important to others. So different ways of listening, active listening, be willing to learn, being open to learn about others. Thank you so much. There's so much stuff in the chat. I can hardly keep up, and I'm delighted by that. Respect all cultures and be aware of cultural differences. Open to learn about others and not make assumptions. And I'm sure many more things. Thank you for adding things there. I'm going to continue. You can continue to put things in the chat. I also will circle back in a moment just to make sure if there are any questions. So you might want to put those in chat if there's something still on your mind. I do want to share a few resources with you though, because there were research pieces that I mentioned to you and stories. So I mentioned Paulo Freire. That was the popular education concept about learning from people who may have learned generationally. There is an article about cultural competence or cultural humility. This is kind of the benefits and the limitations of cultural competence. Remember, Dr. Ella Green Mouton and Meredith Minkler did that research. The Movement for Black Lives, there is a link there for you there as well. Cultural humility versus cultural competence. That's another piece of research and an article that you might find of interest if you want to do a little further study. For your person-centered practices and further learning, you know that the Learning Community website will have the skill reflection sheet and just some additional information about person-centered practices in general. We did not talk about one-page descriptions in this training because I wasn't doing a deep dive into any skills, but one-page descriptions, which you all are familiar with because I know you're on a person-centered journey there in the district. This is a great place to include cultural information. So in the most general sense, but in the ways that are important to the person, that can be included in a one-page description. So I would encourage you to look at where you may see it in examples of some of the one-page descriptions that you have already, or how can you strengthen the ones that you have. There is an article here about neurodiversity and what physicians can learn. And this is really about kind of shifting the power balance, understanding about brains being different or on a continuum or a spectrum of functioning. So I think this is a great article just to kind of help us think about the ethics of labeling people and about differences and how we approach them. There's an article on implicit bias and one on a training on implicit bias. Both of these are from the Kirwan Institute, which you may be familiar with. They have some great materials out there. Someone asked for me to go back 2 pages. Michael, tell me when I get there. I'm going to go backwards here for just a second. Is it here you were looking for?
Yes. I just
Okay.
want a picture of it, Saga.
Got it. I'm gonna hold here for a minute for your screenshot.
Okay, I got it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and I'm just taking a look back in questions and answers and chat. Will the slides and resources be provided? I know they have been sent. I'm not sure. Dr. Van Horn, do you have a way you usually distribute or post those somewhere?
We will post them on the DDS website under the Positive Behavior Support link. Or
Excellent.
you can email me and I will send them to you directly.
Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any additional questions in chat. So I'll move ahead and give you a couple more just contact information. If I can help you in any way, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm pretty good about getting back to folks about this. I just love to hear what people are doing with person-centered practices. So please don't hesitate to reach out. This is my email address. And I think that's it. Dr. Van Horn, is there anything you'd like to say in terms of closing? I think we have about 5 minutes. So I want to make sure everybody gets their needs met before we take off.
Well, this is the first in a series of webinars that we're presenting with SDA. So be on the lookout for webinars through September. And it's perfectly fine to invite DSPs, program managers, your BSP clinicians. Everybody is welcome. So I look forward to seeing you all in future webinars.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me here. I'm trying to back up to a slide for someone if you wonder why I'm looking confused here. I think it's this one. Venice, is that right? Or is it one more? Okay, you got it. All right, just so folks can take pictures of the slide that they want to take pictures of. And again, these will be posted as Dr. Van Horn mentioned to you. Thank you for letting me be here. It was a pleasure to talk with you all today. I hope this has been helpful, and I really look forward to seeing you in any future sessions that we do. And that is it from me today. I'll be here for another 4 minutes or so, just watching if there are any questions or chats or any needs that anyone has.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
This is
you.
always my favorite part of training. It's the
Thank
thank you
you.
course at the
Thank
end. It's so
you.
much fun. Thank you.
Thank you and have a
Great
good
having
one.
you.
Thank you all.
Enjoy the rest of your day, Tanya.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good to
Dr.
see you,
Van Horn.
Michael. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tanya and Debbie.